Hello, everyone. My name is Chloe Edwards with Voices for Virginia's Children. I am our Advocacy and Engagement Manager. Today, I'm going to talk to you about justice advocacy. And this is brought to you by Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia with the mission to empower marginalized communities and acknowledgement of truth to promote healing, reconciliation, and justice. I encourage you to visit vakids.org, click the Racial Truth banner or call out box in order to get more advocacy resources like this under advocacy tools. So in order to really understand how justice works in the United States of America, we have to peel back the layers and layers of history in order to understand how we got here. The United States is among the most diverse democracies in the world. However, much of its history includes systems of violence and discrimination that have not only had traumatic consequences for those directly affected, but it has affected future generations and communities. Slavery in the United States spanned from the 1600s to the mid 1800s. It's estimated that 6 to 7 million enslaved Africans were imported to the United States during the 18th century alone. The rapid expansion of the cotton industry in the late 1700s and early 1800s made Southern states dependent upon slavery for their economic prosperity. Virginia was the second largest state for the importation of enslaved Africans and the number one state for the domestic slave trade. And Richmond, Virginia, was the epicenter of that trade. Richmond's economic success in the antebellum period is largely due to the impact of the slave trade as a commercial enterprise. In fact, in the 1850s, Richmond's biggest business by dollar value, it wasn't tobacco, flour, or iron, but it was slaves. So think about what it means to be a resident of Richmond, Virginia, the capital, a resident of Virginia, a resident of the United States of America, as we sit in this kind of entrenched history, which perpetuated inequalities. Race is a social construct. It was implemented in order to create privilege and oppression within our society. Pictured here is the Constitutional Convention. Took place May 14 to September 17th of 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The purpose of the event was to decide how America was going to be governed. On September 17th, 1787, the Constitution of the United States of America was signed by 38 of the 41 delegates present. Now note that the following 7 figures, also known as the Founding Fathers, played powerful roles and were present. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington. They played critical and substantial roles in the formation of the country's new government, but ultimately our legacy as an inclusive society. Yet in this picture is all white men. There is no women present. There is no people of color, no Black and brown bodies were able to contribute to America's legacy as an inclusive nation. So what does that mean? And how does that contribute to the injustices? How does it contribute to the protection of democracy, of the inclusivity of people of color in this society when they were not represented at this meeting? The emancipation of slavery occurred in 1862. However, from 1865 to 1607, Southern states enacted a series of laws intended to circumscribe the lives of African Americans. These were harsh laws that penalized anyone attempting to leave a job before an advance had been worked off of. They were known as pig laws that unfairly penalized poor African Americans just set free from slavery for crimes such as stealing a farm animal. And vagrancy statutes made it a crime to be unemployed. Many misdemeanors or trivial offenses were treated as felonies with harsh sentences and fines. These laws were used to surveillance Black people and further enslave them through the criminal justice system through a practice known as convict leasing. It made it illegal to not work, which made to not be employed, which made Black folks reliant on their previous slaveholders so that they wouldn't be incarcerated. Black folks couldn't vote, couldn't join a militia, couldn't testify. Different states had different rules. Some banned Black people altogether. These were known as Black codes that allowed African Americans certain rights, but also denied other rights, such as the ability to marriage, ownership of a property, limited access to the courts, to be represented on a jury, etc. Ultimately, what slavery created was inequalities, oppression, and privilege within our society. And so when it comes to the ability to access services and resources such as healthcare, such as mental health services, such as economic prosperity, we have to look at equality and equity and how that plays a role in our society. What equality does is makes it so that everyone receives the same services equal. You get this, you get this, you get this, and it's all equal. What equity does is recognize the disparities that exist within our society. For example, when you disaggregate data and see that something is disparate, like COVID-19 hospitalizations, for example, it means that this population needs a little bit extra resources in order to truly be equal in our society because of their status of oppressed. Suppression efforts ranged from seemingly unobstructive laws like voter ID laws and cuts to early voting, to mass purges of voter rolls and systematic disenfranchisement. And long before election cycles even begin, legislators can redraw district lines that determine the weight of your vote before you even get to the ballot. Certain communities are particularly susceptible to suppression and in some cases outright targeted. People of color, students, the elderly, people with disabilities. 70% of Georgia voters were purged in 2018, for example, were Black. Across the country, 1 in 13 Black Americans cannot vote due to disenfranchisement laws. 1/3 of voters who have a disability report difficulty voting because of the lack of accommodations. Only 40% of polling places fully accommodate people with disabilities. And across the country, counties with larger minority populations have fewer polling sites and poll workers per voter. This creates long lines at the ballot boxes. And so someone would have the privilege to call out to work, such as paid time off, or have that flexibility in order to cast their vote and making their voice heard. Another example is that 6 in 10 college students coming from out of state in New Hampshire, the state tried to block residents with out of state driver's license from voting. Forms of oppression are noted here, including voter ID laws, voter registration restrictions, such as having to get your registration done and within a certain amount of time, voter purges, felony disenfranchisement, felons not being able to vote, and then gerrymandering, like we mentioned, and that can be done by partisan beliefs such as Republican, Democrat, or by race. So let's go through, when did it start? Why? What is the impact? This video will walk you through that.
We got bananas, we packed some snack bags, we got water, we're giving out pizza, ponchos if it rains.
We had people out there with like cold water coolers and like snacks and people telling them to stay strong and stay in line. This is what they're doing. They're doing this on purpose so that your voice is not heard. I'm just like, this is going on right now in 2020. It's really ridiculous.
Voter suppression has come up quite a bit during this election cycle. President Trump tonight after floating the idea of delaying the November election that he does not have the power to do is renewing his attacks on mail-in voting. Despite no evidence, it leads to widespread voter fraud.
From the president's warnings about voter fraud via mail-in ballots, to the new Tennessee law that could strip some protesters of their voting rights, or the messy primaries in states like Georgia, Wisconsin, and Louisiana.
When I think about voter suppression and people ask me, well, when did it start? And I say it started when Africans were enslaved and forced to come to this country. There's never been a period of time in this country that there was not voter suppression.
We would love for you all to, one, really share about some of the issues that are going on in your community. Why is this election important? Why is it important that South Georgia is not left out of the process? Because you ain't, because Black voters matter.
Latasha Brown is a longtime political organizer and co-founder of Black Voters Matter, an organization aiming to boost Black voter turnout in presidential and local elections. Their work includes increasing voter registration, voter education, and advocating for policies that expand voting rights and access.
The first election we worked in was in the U.S. Senate race.
And NBC News is now calling Doug Jones the apparent winner.
In a special nationally followed election, Democrat Doug Jones and Republican Roy Moore fought for a Senate seat in Alabama. And for the first time in 25 years, Alabama elected a Democrat to the Senate. And the Black vote was key for the Jones win, with 96% of Black voters backing him.
We use some new tools, new technologies to help concentrate on getting out the vote. And that's what
Black voter turnout increased drastically, and that there was an overperformance of Black voters in that particular election cycle. But we wanted to also send a message of affirmation of how Black voters saw themselves. We would convene these listening circles to talk to communities about what was it that they were concerned about, how did they see power, did they want power, and what did that look like?
Say your name.
My name is Evelyn Glass. If you don't get them in the primary, you won't get them there. Because some people just go to that one, but we got to start in the primary to get those people.
That's right. That's right.
This is primary day in Georgia. Lines in Atlanta stretching for blocks. Some standing in the rain, forced to wait hours to cast a ballot.
You've been here about 3 hours. I'm not leaving.
In Georgia, where I live and I am a voter, on election day, what we saw is we saw long lines. I myself, it took me 3 hours to vote. We also got a phone call at 10:30 p.m. that there were 300 African-American voters waiting in line to vote.
It is 11:45 in Georgia, and guess what? We're still at a polling site.
The last voter at that site did not leave until 12:37 a.m.
I had to take my client to go vote because she wanted to go vote in Sandy Springs, and we was in and out in 7 minutes. But I live here in Southwest Atlanta, so this is where I have to go vote, and I've been in line for at least 30 minutes already, and I don't know how long I'm gonna be here.
I waited for maybe like 2 to 2.5 hours to vote.
The voting delay occurred in Fulton County, home to 15 cities, including Atlanta, which has a majority Black population.
The primaries in June made me think of what it would be like to live through a tsunami or other natural disaster. And in a sense, it was a natural disaster.
Fulton County election official admitted that there were problems and blamed the delays on an unexpected surge in absentee voting and a reduced number of voting locations due to the pandemic.
We found ourselves with 20% less places than we normally would use for an election. This made it impossible to do a good job, and we didn't.
A Democracy docket investigation conducted of Georgia's presidential primaries found that in polling places where the majority of voters were minorities, there was an average wait time of 51 minutes. Meanwhile, at polling locations where white voters were the majority, the average wait time was 6 minutes. Voter suppression isn't a new battle for Black voters in Georgia. In the 2018 governor's race, then Secretary of State Republican Brian Kemp faced off against Stacey Abrams. Kemp's office was accused of purging more than 500,000 voters from the rolls back in 2017. An analysis obtained by the Associated Press reveals racial disparity. Georgia's population is 32% Black, but the list of voter registrations on hold with Kemp's office was 70% Black. In 2018, his office said that they simply conduct regular list maintenance of the voter rolls to ensure election integrity.
So you saw the women's suffrage movement. What was interesting is that while African-American, while Black women stood with white women in the women's suffrage movement, and we were an instrumental force in that movement, we did not secure the right to vote for ourselves to even 50 years later.
On March 7, 1965, a group of protesters gathered at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, calling for voting rights, with 25-year-old John Lewis leading the way.
We intend to march to Montgomery.
It was the first in a series of planned marches from Selma to Montgomery.
Often what you saw in the Deep South, that people were not even allowed to register to vote. That when they went to register to vote, would walk up and the registrar would say, in order to register, you have to tell me how many jelly beans are in a jar. Or just some ridiculous questions that they would ask them as a tool to prevent them from being able to register. It was in August the 6th, 1965, where the Voting Rights Act was passed. And it was passed because of the work of those folks on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the work all of those years that activists had been doing to demand the right to vote.
In 2013, the Supreme Court invalidated a key part of the Voting Rights Act, and activists alleged that the Supreme Court's decision empowered some states to disenfranchise voters.
So we start seeing in the states that we worked in and lived in voter ID laws, strict voter ID laws. We start seeing a massive closing of polls. We start seeing suppression tactics raise up.
Congressman John Lewis risked his life to expand voting rights. Latasha sees him as an instrumental figure that paved the way for the work that she's doing today.
We must never, ever forget the sacrifice of men and women who put their bodies on the line for freedom and equality.
What they taught me is what is possible. Where do I and my generation want to take the nation next? We need a radically reimagined America and the way that we conduct voting and elections, that ultimately we should have universal voting. We should have same-day registration. There should be more, instead of where it's been very decentralized, the voting process, that there needs to be more alignment around that. This isn't about the Republicans or the Democrats. The bottom line is voting is a nonpartisan issue. Every single citizen should have free and fair access to the ballot.
When I say Black voters, you say matter. Black voters. Black voters. When I say Black voters, you say matter. Black voters.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for
So, as you can see, a lot of attention put on Georgia, just as we're seeing now in the news. So these kinds of suppression efforts, like you saw the long lines, how certain communities were targeted, et cetera, still exist today. So as we think about an equitable and just society, we also have to think about voters' rights. It's really relevant. It determines representation. It determines how certain communities are represented. And that kind of helps bring me to the next slide. So pictured in this picture is a really powerful committee. These are called the money committees. Money committee members, which is your Senate Finance and House Appropriations, determines the state budget, what to fund, how much, identifies problems and solutions in turning an idea into a law. And then on the broader end, money is what backs a bill or a budget amendment. And so it determines how laws are implemented in society and whether they get funded. We also have to recognize that this picture is not diverse. Very little representation culturally when it comes to our representatives. And so that brings me to the question, who gets to be a policymaker? Well, one, in Virginia, we have a part-time legislature. So they make between about $30,000, just estimating. And so the person that gets to be a policymaker would need to have access to a job where they can independently create their own schedule or be able to sacrifice not to work in a 30 to 45 day session or a 60-day session on even years. So with that being said, they also need to fund their campaign, which means they have to have large, prestigious networks that can invest in their campaign in their campaign funds while they're on the trail. So that again goes back to privilege in our society and who has access to prosperity and wealth. And we see that our society has a history of implementing privilege and oppression and inequities. And so likely the majority population, white people, will have more access. When it comes to the making of a law, please note that every bill just starts out as an idea. You may see a trend in your locality or best practices is something you care about, such as mental health or trauma-informed care. You may see challenges around, for example, food access or economic prosperity. And then you may reach out to your public official or others who share that similar experience to you or passion in order to really advocate for a bill to turn into a law. This could be constituents, advocates, lobbyists, helping policymakers to highlight a specific interest. Some bills are in response to a tragedy, such as Virginia Tech, police brutality, Sandy Hook shooting. There's also the personal tragedies, such as Senator Deed's son Gus, who was in a mental health crisis and needed access to a hospital bed and couldn't get it within a certain amount of time. And so he advocated for temporary emergency detention orders. A legislator would typically sponsor a piece of legislation and gets a bill number to represent that piece of legislation in order to track it. Hundreds of bills are introduced every year, thousands. This year it's limited because of the virtuality of session. But in a normal year, you'd see about 3,000 bills. A bill is proposed and submitted by a General Assembly member to create a new law, to amend a new law, or remove an existing law. And then you can work with advocacy organizations like Voices for Virginia's Children. For example, join our networks, our foster care network, Early Childhood Education, or the Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia Coalition to work year long and connecting trends you're seeing in your community to political opportunity. Ways to advocate? Well, you can provide testimony at hearings. So if you're working with an advocacy organization like ours, we may send out an alert asking for action or a call for stories in order to help you prep to provide your testimony. You can invite an elected official to your celebrations or to visit your programs. For example, if you work in the early childhood education community, you may invite a legislator to some sort of event or to your preschool. The best time to connect with your legislators in the off session, because you simply have more capacity and they simply have more capacity because they are not facing a General Assembly session. You can attend advocacy days. And so you'll see on the Voices website that we have a digital advocacy day on the 25th. And then you can also use social media. And so we'll also be publishing a social media toolkit this year in order for you to just simply copy and paste statuses on your social media. Well, there's also an advocacy form that you can fill out to submit your story and ways in which your story can be used. You can also sign up to be a Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, email advocate. And so we'll be able to track how many advocates will be sharing our information this session. Communicating with policymakers. You always want to be positive and nonpartisan. So Voices is a nonprofit, which means that we are also nonpartisan. So we work with Republicans, Democrats, et cetera, and don't let your partisan beliefs dissuade you from working with someone who may have different beliefs. Bipartisan support is even more powerful than partisan support. Be personal. So again, leverage that personal story or your professional story connected with the work that you do, and do see yourself as an expert because you likely may know more about a particular issue than your public official because they can't know all things. Be persistent and patient. Policy is very incremental. We've been working on certain policy initiatives for 8 to 10 years and have been dipping our toes more and more into it each year to achieve that bold success that we really want. Stay on the message. So you may find that a legislator may be interested in something specific that you're talking about, but always say, what am I trying to get out of this meeting, and connect it to that call to action. Never give inaccurate information. They will remember it. They'll likely write the information down and use it maybe in another meeting, and then it was inaccurate. So it just doesn't look good. So it's okay to say, you know what, I'm going to get back to you on that. And if you are attending an advocacy day, you'll always have a voice, a staff member with you who may know the answer. But even we sometimes have to use that. I'm going to get back to you on that. That's a great question. And relax. Legislators are just everyday people like you and me. They have families that they go home to. They have their passions, their grandchildren, children, etc. And so keep that in mind. In preparing for your meeting, it's always a good idea to research your area of interest. You can also research voting history, committee assignments, their full-time profession. For example, if they're a lawyer, they may be innately interested in injustice issues. If they're one of their committee assignments is the House Appropriations or Senate Finance, that's a great legislator to build a relationship with. Develop an agenda, a purpose of that meeting. Think, what do I want to get out of it? And make that agenda very tight and keep it on the message. Assume you'll only have 10 to 15 minutes, much less during the legislative session. And then assemble your supporting materials. So this could be fact sheets, data. It's always good to use data, stories, and then that policy agenda item, which would be connecting it to that call to action. So here's an example of a legislative meeting. You introduce yourself, you describe the problem or the issue that you're seeing, tell your personal story, and remember the 3 keys to a successful story is keeping it short, having a point, and then tying it to the solution or your position. I'm asking you to support this. I'm asking you to oppose this. You can make it personal, even more personal, by talking about what's happening in their specific district. So for example, if you're a partner, but you have a different legislative target that's outside of where you may live, you may reach out to one of your partners that may live in that district so that you can personalize that story or find, or if you see specific innovative examples, you can leverage that great thing that's happening in their district and talk about it. Clearly state the request and ask for their position, support this, oppose this, and then thank them no matter what. They're not always going to support what you're asking for, or they may even tell you, well, I support this component of it, but I don't support this component of it. And just respectfully say thank you. It's all right. Folks are not going to always support what you may want. It may be some education. Again, policy is incremental. So one thing to introduce is in your legislative meetings, you're going to need content. You're going to need a specific policy priority that you want to introduce. And so this year, Virginia is Voices for Virginia's Children is supporting Delegate Aird's resolution to declare racism as a public health crisis. We know while great awareness has been raised around trauma-informed policy and practice over the last few years, we must acknowledge that this approach is incomplete. We have to combat the root cause of trauma that is perpetuated in communities. We have to combat what creates adversity in communities. Today, historically, communities are raising their voice on behalf of much needed acknowledgement of systematic inequities and the perpetuation of trauma and toxic systems and policy around police brutality, criminal justice, the social determinants of health as we see inequities in COVID-19 deaths and hospitalizations. And so that goes back to that equality and equity. Equality gives everyone the same exact resources. Equity acknowledges the disparities affiliated with oppression and inequality, and therefore distributes resources based off of the needs of recipients. What we're advocating for is a society that is a just society for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, or the community in which people live. So we have to declare racism as a public health crisis. Now, if I was going to break this down into the specific story that we talked about in our legislative meeting, I might incorporate a little bit of data and a personal story. So at the legislative meeting, hi, I'd say, hi, Senator Hanger. My name is Chloe Edwards with Voices for Virginia's Children. Today, I'm with the Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia Coalition. We're advocating for Virginia to declare racism as a public health crisis. 19% of children in Virginia experience 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. However, in 2017 to 2018, 37% of Black children experienced 2 or more adverse childhood experiences, which is almost double the rate of trauma that all children experience. We need an equitable and just society for all children, regardless of their race and ethnicity, because children are Virginia's future and we must give them the future that they deserve. I'm asking that you support Delegate Ayer's resolution to declare racism as a public health crisis. And then I could even personalize it and say, I was one of those children when I was a child. On the adverse childhood experience questionnaire, I had 8 of 10 adverse childhood experience as a veteran of Virginia's foster care system through kinship care. So again, you can connect that data to a personal story and then say, as a response, I know that this is the right solution. Virginia must declare racism as a public health crisis and join other states that have done so. So that's an example of a legislative meeting. And then this is your policy agenda item, which has a talking point that you can incorporate into your call to ask. Here are some upcoming advocacy opportunities. We have the Brown, Virginia Dr. King Day of Action, January 18th from 9 to 1 p.m. You can go to our Facebook page at Racial Truth, click events in order to see that, or you can go to our webpage, vakids.org/racial-truth. We also have an event, Racial Truth and Reconciliation, Historical Perspectives, Reckoning the Past and Reconciling the Present, 3 to 4:45 p.m. that day. And with this event, you'll leave this event with opportunities to pursue your own journey of racial truth and reconciliation. We're partnering with the education and art entities who will highlight their role in the retelling of history and the pursuance of racial truth and reconciliation within the context of their organizations, but also the Commonwealth. So we're partnering with VMFA, Initiatives of Change, the Valentine, the Library of Virginia, the Civil War Museum. I believe I got all of them. Yes, I believe I got all of them. And then we also have our campaign for Trauma Informed Virginia, Racial Truth and Reconciliation Digital Advocacy Day on the 25th. So again, go to the events page and fill out your advocacy form, and it'll be good practice for you to think about some of the tactics that we talked about today as it relates to advocacy. Again, there's a link to our website now, which is live. We're also going to be launching equity impact statements this week. You can view the Voices legislative agenda. And then we have videos uploaded to our YouTube breaking our policy agendas down. Also join our listservs, whatever resonates with you, whether it's early childhood education, child welfare, or family economic security, and more, because we'll be sending out action alerts throughout session and ways that you can get involved in advocacy. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can comment a question on our Facebook, and then our staff will get to them. Does anyone have any questions? All right, well, if there's no questions, thank you for tuning in to our justice advocacy training. My name is Chloe Edwards. You can always contact me at Chloe, CHLOE @vakids.org if you do come across any questions. And again, we thank you for joining us today, and goodbye.